Hello and good evening and welcome to this very special wildlife that we've organised in a bit of a rush for January. We weren't planning to have a wildlife in January, but when a certain thing happened just a week or so ago, we suddenly thought it was essential. We've pulled this together very rapidly over the last few days to discuss this big issue about bees and neonicotinoids. You know, in my career as an environmental campaigner, what's been absolutely astonishing that I've noticed is no issue connects to the public more than bees. People really care about bees, and bees are almost like an ambassador for the story about what's happening in the wider natural world. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken action for British bees through many, many different organizations over the last couple of decades, and people really care about bees. But of course, there's always been a big debate about them and about insects more widely, and obviously around the role of pesticides in our agriculture. And so when George Eustice, Secretary of State for Agriculture, George Eustice took the decision at the start of 2021 to allow what's called a derogation on the ban on neonicotinoids, in other words, a temporary lifting of the ban on a particular type of neonicotinoids, we as the Wildlife Trust wanted to oppose that. But we also wanted to create the time and space to have a good discussion and debate about that. And that's what we're doing tonight. I'm delighted to say that we've had record numbers of people register to watch this debate tonight ahead of time. Over 2,000 of you registered to watch tonight. So we hope you will enjoy the evening. And I'm delighted with the panel that we've been able to put together for tonight. I'm going to reveal more about the panel shortly, but first of all, let's kick off with a brief video to just summarize recent developments around bees and neonicotinoids. Thank you. So we can see that there are people right across the UK and beyond watching tonight. Keep those hellos going in the YouTube chat. It's great to know where you're watching tonight, and we hope you are enjoying it. Now, I tantalizingly warmed you up to say we've got a fantastic panel, and we really have. I'm delighted that we've been able to pull it together, and I'm very grateful, I'll say this in advance, to all the panelists that have changed plans and be able to join us at very short notice for this important discussion. It would be hard to think of being able to put together a better panel than we've done so. So let's go through our fantastic Fab Four for this evening. We have Dave Gorson, Professor Dave Gorson, Professor of Biology at the University of Sussex and actually an ambassador for the Wildlife Trusts. Dave is the UK's leading expert on insects with a focus on bumblebees, and he has worked on the Wildlife Trust Action for Insects campaign, and he'd been known to many of you as an accomplished author, shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize in 2013 and acclaimed for The Garden Jungle and A Sting in the Tail. In 2006, Dave founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust to engage the public in taking action to save the species. We're delighted that Dave's able to join us tonight. Also thrilled that we were able to have Tom Clark, a farmer, join us tonight. Tom Clark farms just over 1,000 acres of fen near Ely in Cambridgeshire, not far from where I am at the moment in Cambridge. And Tom grows wheat, sugar beet, of course, and potatoes. Now, Tom is a self-confessed nature-friendly farmer. Tom's farm is under the higher level stewardship scheme and has worked with the RSPB to set up and run the Ely Nature Friendly Farming Zone. And Tom sits on the National Farmers Union 2040 Net Zero Steering Group and on the NFU Sugar Board. And it's worth saying, we all absolutely agree with Tom's credentials as a nature-friendly farmer. He's well known to many of us, and he's worked in this whole area around nature-friendly farming for a long time. And he will be making the case tonight for the derogation. And we thought it was really good to have someone to make the case for the derogation, but also someone that is clearly signed up to trying to put nature into recovery so that we can get into that issue around pesticides, rather than necessarily having to argue about the need to put nature into recovery. So Tom, we're so pleased you could join us tonight and make this case. Thank you very much. Caroline Coursey, our third panelist. Caroline is an agronomist with the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust. Caroline has a master's in applied entomology at Imperial College, which gave her a taste of biological control and different spraying systems. She then went on to manage arable field trials before progressing to become a fully fledged agronomist, looking after 15,000 acres, giving advice on rotations, nutrients, pest and disease control. And since 2005, she has been senior land advisor with the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust, managing the Trust's 85-hectare mixed arable farmland and liaising and delivering advice and numerous projects within the farming community. And it's worth saying, in case you don't know, the Wildlife Trusts collectively do run a number of working farms where we try and show how nature-friendly farming can work. Finally, we have Liz Bowles, who's Associate Director for Farming and Land Use at the Soil Association, leading the charity's work with farmers. Liz has worked with the agri-food sector for over 20 years in a number of leading roles. She's a Nuffield Scholar, an Oxford Farming Director, and manages one of the largest pedigree flocks of Shropshire sheep in the UK. I imagine it's lambing season then, Liz, yeah? Must be busy.
Absolutely, right now. Yeah.
Right. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that later. Okay, well, thank you again to the whole panel for joining us for this discussion tonight. So we're going to kick off going straight to Tom and hear his case as to why he thinks it's right to have this derogation, this temporary lifting of the ban of neonics around the use of sugar beet. And we were talking to Tom in advance about doing the usual thing and giving a bit of presentation here. But Tom, at your asking, and we're delighted you did, you said actually what you want to do is put together a little video from the farm and show that tonight, which is what he's done. So over to Tom, but on the video.
So this is a field of sugar beet. We grow it in a rotation with other crops, so it's usually only in a field like this once every 4 to 6 years. And it's a valuable part of the rotation. It provides soil health and plant health benefits to all the other crops that we grow in that rotation. Sugar beet's also a really good crop for biodiversity. As part of a rotation, it means it's planted in the spring, which means we can do things to the field over winter, like leave it fallow or plant cover crops, and it's a good habitat for spring birds who need to nest and forage in spring. It also helps feed Buick swans and other migratory swans that come here to overwinter. Sugar beet's a really fantastic plant. It uses the chlorophyll in its leaves to take sunlight, combine that energy with water and air, and turn it into sugar, which it puts into its roots, and the roots grow really large. About 20%, or about a fifth, of the roots are then sugar, which gets taken a short way down the road and is sliced up and has the sugar washed out of its roots with hot water. And once we've taken the sugar out of the roots, the leftovers are used for other things like animal feed. There's an extract in the roots used in toiletries and shampoos. And the process itself generates loads of other useful products. The factories produce electricity for the local area. The sugar itself can be turned into bioethanol. They've been using it to make a lot of hand sanitizer recently. So it's a multifunctional crop. The sugar beet is planted in the spring and it grows all through the summer, and we harvest it from October to about February. So we're coming towards the end of our harvest this year. And to show you what a fully grown sugar beet looks like, it should look should look something like this. It's quite big, nice healthy leaves on top, and that is a good sugar beet. Sadly, when the virus attacks, the virus yellows is transmitted by an aphid which bites the sap of the young plant. When the virus gets into it, stops it growing, and the result is something more like this. This is a virus yellows affected sugar beet. Some growers in the UK are seeing losses of up to 80% of their yields. In the past, farmers have used neonicotinoid pesticides, not as sprays for sugar beet, but as part of a seed. So the seeds of the sugar beet are taken and turned into little pellets, a bit like Skittles or M&Ms, and one of those little layers around the seed contains this very tiny amount of this pesticide, which was it put into the soil, and the growing plant absorbs that insecticide, which makes it poisonous for the green fly. So if they eat it, they die very quickly. And that protection from that seed treatment lasts for about 10 to 14 weeks. And that's enough time to protect the growing sugar beet plant until it's big enough that the aphids can't bite it and can't transmit the disease. Why have we had such a problem this year? We've not had neonicotinoid seed treatments for 2 years. The problem we've had this year is partly to do with climate change. We've had a much warmer winter than we would expect, and that's led to much higher numbers of these green fly than ever in recorded as far back as records go. If this had happened in 2 or 3 years' time, we would be there with the new varieties and the other solutions. The fact is, this has caught up with us so quickly. It takes a year to try anything new in farming. You've got to go through a complete growing cycle. So we've only had 2 goes at coping without these insecticides. We got away with it last year. This year we really haven't. It's hit us square on the nose, and if it happened again next year, there wouldn't be a sugar industry in this country the year after. So when we've asked the government to approve the use of these chemicals, they have gone to independent scientific experts to look at what we're suggesting, and we have suggested lots of ways to limit any risk of harm to pollinators and the wider environment. And we have the tightest such restrictions. We volunteered the tightest such restrictions across the whole of the EU. So in France and Germany they'll be using these chemicals, but with less restrictions on how they're used. So people ask me, this is sugar. Why risk any harm to the environment at all from just growing sugar, which is something that is unhealthy and we can get from other places? And I say, yes, we can get it from other places. We can cut down how much we eat, but we'll still have some, and we'll have to get that from somewhere. And bringing it in from Brazil or Australia isn't necessarily the answer. I mean, those countries already use more than 26 different pesticides which are banned in the UK. And threaten habitats such as the Amazon or the Great Barrier Reef. This is farmland. It's farmland that supports its own biodiversity and its own farmed environment, and losing sugar beet from that will damage that environment just as much. And we don't want to use these pesticides. This is a last resort. This really is an emergency for our industry. If we can get this use of these pesticides and use it as a stepping stone, as a bridge to a future where we don't have to use chemicals at all, then the UK homegrown sugar industry will be back to being the most sustainable and environmentally friendly source of sugar for however much we eat of it for the future. And that's what I want to do. I don't really relish the prospect of using these pesticides at all.
Okay, so there's Tom from the farm making his case, and Tom, a very persuasive case, I have to say. You got to me, almost persuaded me, not quite though, but almost. Very persuasive case. Before we go on to hear from others, let me ask you this one question, Tom, then. So we even, if we believe you want to move on from neonics as soon as possible and commit to nature-friendly farming, problem is, with this derogation, what's to stop it just becoming an annual event? What's it to stop the, with climate change getting worse, as you say, what's to stop actually us just getting stuck in a phase where every year we have to have yet another derogation, as it's argued, and actually this becomes the new normal and neonics being used again?
Well, I think it's a fair question, and I think a lot of people are, even if they can see the case for this particular use and with these particular restrictions, they're worried that this is the thin end of a wedge, and actually this is a direction of travel, and having these chemicals will mean we don't need to try to find alternatives. But I have to say, I think what's happened since the announcement and the reaction that we've had. I mean, you were right talking earlier about people really care about bees. People really care about their food. And I'm really glad they care about nature. I'm really glad they care about their food. And I don't think that it will be acceptable for this to be the new normal. And I think there are plenty of farmers that don't want it to be the new normal. I would count myself in that as well. And I think, you know, the case has been made and failed to sort of lift the restrictions on neonicotinoids across the board. I don't think we're going to revisit those arguments. I think this is really a one-off, maybe not one-off actually. I think we might need it next year again, but I think this is a special case, and I don't think we're going to go back to the old ways.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Well, we're going to spend a lot of time tonight, of course, talking about the alternatives. And of course, we all know it's not a simple one, actually. It's not a simple answer about the alternatives, and that's why we need to have the time and space to explore them. But let's move on for a moment. Let's move to Dave Gorson, our next speaker tonight, next panelist. I introduced Dave earlier. Dave, would you in particular explain the science and evidence to us around the impact that neonicotinoids have on pollinating insects, which led to their ban in the European Union, and of course that commitment by the UK government, by Michael Gove back in 2018, to keep the ban in place on neonicotinoids when we left the European Union as well? And just explain a little bit, what do neonics do to bees and other pollinating insects? Dave.
Hi, Craig. Sure. So I've been studying wild bees, mainly bumblebees, for the last nearly 30 years. And spent about the last 12 years looking at the impacts of neonicotinoids on bees and other wildlife. And I was delighted when the European Union introduced the ban in 2018. And obviously, I'm really sad to see it return. And I want to just quickly, I haven't got time to give a sort of detailed lecture on these chemicals, but give everyone a kind of feel for them. So they were introduced, neonicotinoids are a class of insecticides, neurotoxins that were introduced in 1994 in the UK, and mainly used as a seed dressing, as Tom explained. And they became very popular, not just in the UK, but worldwide. They became the insecticide of choice, used on a huge scale. And in part because they are very toxic to all insect life, toxic on a scale that's quite hard to get your head around, much more toxic than chemicals that came before, like DDT or the organophosphates or whatever. So just to illustrate that, so toxicity is usually measured by an LD50 assay in the lab, which is the LD50 stands for the lethal dose that kills half your test organisms, 50%. And the LD50 for the most commonly used neonics, including the one which is being allowed back with this derogation, is about 4 billionths of a gram per honeybee, which you can't imagine. So let me put it another way. That means that 1 teaspoon is 5 grams of one of these chemicals is enough to give a lethal dose to 1.25 billion. That's about 125 tons of honeybees, 1.25 billion individual bees, enough to fill 4 long wheelbase lorries with dead bees just from 1 teaspoon of the chemical. And at the height, just before the ban, we were applying 110 tons of neonics to the British landscape every year. Now, the first environmental problem that emerged with neonics was it's as early as 1995, the year after they started being used, French beekeepers complained that their bees were dying if they were keeping them near sunflowers. It very quickly became clear that if these seed dressings were applied to flowering crops, because the chemical's systemic, it spreads throughout the plant, that it goes into the nectar and the pollen. So essentially bees were getting a healthy dose of neurotoxin every time they tried to pollinate a sunflower or an oilseed rape or any other flowering crop. So in 2013, the European Union banned the use of neonics on flowering crops. But unfortunately, it quickly became clear that that hadn't solved the problem, and bees were still being exposed. If we sampled honey from bee nests, it still had neonics in. Bees still seemed to be declining. So that caused sort of a flurry of research to understand why. And essentially it comes down to this, that although the neonic is intended to go into the crop, it's put on the seed, when it dissolves in the wet soil, when the seed is drilled, only about 5% of it is sucked up by the crop plant, which means 95% of these chemicals are going into the soil and the soil water. And it transpires that they're quite persistent. They can build up if they're applied every year in the soil, and they can leach into streams. And the way they're getting into bees was they're also taken up by any other plant that has its roots in that contaminated soil. So if you sow a flower strip next to your non-flowering crop, your treated crop, or if you have hedgerows with roots into the field, then they all become contaminated with these neurotoxins. And that's why, so that when it became clear that banning them on flowering crops wasn't doing the job, in 2018, the European Union decided to ban them on all crops, regardless of whether they flowered or not, to try and mitigate this impact. One final thing, I should say, although this debate is really heavily focused on bees, it isn't really about bees. Bees, as Craig said, are kind of the poster child, if you like, for insect conservation, but these chemicals are just as toxic to any other insect, so far as we know. And there are 27,000 species of insect living in the UK. And there's a fair bit of evidence that the chemicals also impact on aquatic insects, herbivorous insects feeding on hedgerow plants, and soil insects. So it's certainly a bigger story than just bees. Anyway, that's probably enough from me for the moment.
Dave, thank you very much. Really appreciate you going through the science of that and explaining it just very patiently for everyone. It's a complicated area. One question I'm going to throw back at you, because I know it's one that, you know, we've heard a lot the last few days. This is a derogation to allow the use of neonicotinoids as a seed dressing on sugar beet crops. Maybe you can explain what that is? What is a seed dressing? And indeed, also just explain a bit more. Does that mean we should be less worried, more worried, or actually is it kind of irrelevant to whether what it means for neonicotinoids and wildlife?
So the dominant use in Europe has always been as a seed dressing. About 90% of neonic use before the ban was as seed dressings. As Tom explained in his video, I mean, essentially it means the farmer buys the seed pre-coated with insecticide. And all he has to do is sow it in the ground, and then the young crop sucks up the chemical and is protected. And so that sounds like, you can see why, if you're a farmer, that sounds so simple and easy, you know, ideal solution. Better, you'd think on the face of it, than spraying an insecticide later in the year from the back of a tractor, which might drift on the wind or whatever. It was sold to farmers as a much more targeted way of getting the pesticide to the crop. But as I explained minutes ago, actually, 95% of the pesticide, sadly, doesn't go into the crop, and it's then polluting the environment. So serious cause for concern, I would say.
Okay. Dave, thank you very much. Really good to hear that overview. So then let's go to Caroline. Caroline Coursey, agronomist with the Worcestershire Wildlife Trust. As I said earlier, Caroline has had a strong career as an agronomist, and then working with Worcestershire Wildlife Trust, advising landowners and of course the trust themselves in management of farms for nature-friendly farming. Caroline, what's your perspectives on this, and in particular about the alternatives to neonicotinoids, and what kind of support is there or isn't there for farmers in using alternative methods?
Okay, so I was asked to tell you about my worries as an agronomist about using pesticides and how farmers need to be supported better. So it goes without saying, really, I'm worried about the decision to agree to emergency derogation, particularly when this derogation will be needed for 3 years, from 2021 to 2023. Essentially, what I try to talk about with people is looking on the farm as an ecosystem. But I also dig in deep, I can't help it sometimes, in terms of getting into getting information I've been unable to get the environment information sheet for this particular neonicotinoid because Syngenta haven't yet received the approval notice from the regulatory authorities. This means I can't quote directly from the label, but it triggers another fear that how impossible it is, I would say, to get all pelleted seeds directly out of the way so that things like birds can't eat them. And this product will have a very strict environmental sheet because there is a risk of damage to birds. With a third of our food crops pollinated by insects and as many as 87% of our plants pollinated by animals, there's a lot to lose. And as the Wildlife Trust, we want to reduce by 50% the overall use of and risk from chemical pesticides by 2030. I'm worried without adequate research that we will create new pests. Many farmers all over the place are asking what alternatives are there to pesticides. Are neonicotinoids the only answer? And I know BBRO, the British Beet Research Organisation, is doing trials and including on resistant varieties. I'm concerned that emergency authorisation risks slowing these areas of research. Currently, many farmers across the country feel as though they've got no options, not just sugar beet growers. The government needs to be focusing on regenerative farming practices, supporting farmers to produce nutritional food that has a positive effect on wildlife, rather than giving out a license to pollute soil and kill bees and other critters. This is going to need collaboration, cooperation, imagination, intuition, regulation, incentive, and the process really needs to be speeded up. We must reverse the decline in insects. Some of our farmers that we work with Worcestershire Wildlife Trust are experimenting out of pocket with bespoke flowering plantings, insectaries, really fine-tuning things, even making nest boxes for some of the insects don't travel more than 50 meters to pollinate, let's say, or predate. Others, especially some of our horticulture and soft fruit producers, are facing challenges from invasive insects, spotted-winged Drosophila, threatening their very high investment systems. As a facilitator for this project, a core aim is to keep the albeit disparate group together, evaluate all the issues, share ideas and solutions, and clearly Tom's highly innovative. Many of the growers in fruit have never had basic payment scheme, but they provide, for example, huge amounts of pollen and nectar, a public good. Along with 5 other wildlife trusts, we're participating in one of the largest ELM, environmental land management tests and trials in the country, over 100 farmers. And it's deeply frustrating that we have no clear idea of payment rates yet. And I worry this will not happen fast enough in order for us to achieve 30% of land and sea restored for wildlife by 2030. Cuts of basic payment scheme of at least 50%, basic payment scheme being the subsidy that farmers get on average about £240 a hectare, let's say. There's going to be cuts on this of 50% by 2024. If this is really making people, farmers and wildlife trusts, other land managers focus. Some farmers are saying they're going to stop farming and will take the lump sum that might be on offer. Others want reductions in pesticide and fertilizer use, but high and short-term rents compromise them and push them into more intensive cropping. But they're all keen to know more about agroforestry, holistic grazing, heritage wheat, organic conversion, wilding beavers, integrated pest management, and the list gets bigger every day. The key message that they give me is viable alternatives must be provided and fast.
Great, Caroline. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. So let's move on to Liz Bowles, who's Associate Director with the Soil Association. Liz, the work of the Soil Association will be known to many, perhaps not everyone, shockingly, but you might want to give a bit of discussion about that. But of course, you as an organisation have been working for many years on really working with farmers to develop alternatives to pesticide use. Liz, over to you.
Thank you very much, Craig, and good evening, everybody. Yes, as Craig just said, we're one of the few organisations actually working with farmers to support transitions to more agroecological, more sustainable farming practices. The programme's called Innovative Farmers and it champions farmer-led research. So it's responding to what the questions that farmers ask about how they can reduce their reliance on pesticides. And as I said, it's one of the few programmes doing that. And the Soil Association itself, many of you may know us as an organisation that champions organic. Some of you may indeed byproducts with the Organic Soil Association logo on them, but we do far more than simply certify organic food. We're very involved in supporting all farmers, whether organic or not, to look at how they can farm more sustainably and provide that really active support through championing what works. And the program that we've been running now for the past 8 years, it's called Innovative Farmers, and it's very much about providing farmers with a low risk way of testing new approaches to the kind of problems they face all the time. And reducing reliance on pesticides is one of those key things that farmers want to be able to do, and we do help them to do that. Now, it's perhaps just worth reflecting on why. And everybody now is so concerned both about our nature, but also about climate change. And it's very true to say that unless we can reverse the current decline in our biodiversity worldwide, we really don't stand a chance of dealing with climate change. The two go hand in hand. And if you think about insects, and I think this is one of the sort of core sort of challenges we've got with our current farming practices, we have tended to move towards a situation where we see insects not necessarily as helpful things. But if you think about it, insects are a vital part of our overall ecosystem, not just providing pollination services, but also providing predators for other insects which are harmful to crops. They're also providing food for other parts of the food chain, birds, etc. And it's no real surprise that our decline in our insect life is causing problems in other places. But going back to this support for farmers, I'll give you a couple of examples of how the Soil Association has been working with farmers to reduce their reliance on pesticides. And I'm sure many of you will have heard of the chemical glyphosate. And certainly over the years, the Soil Association has wanted to see a ban on its use pre-harvest in cereals. But there's a real sort of challenge because many farmers want to move to reduce the amount of soil disturbance they have to carry out to establish crops. And using cover crops was a way of doing that. But then if you move to minimal disturbance of soil, very often farmers needed to use glyphosate as part of their management processes during the year. So the Soil Association, through the Innovative Farmers Programme, supported 5 farmers to test out non-chemical mechanisms, including things like using, basically it's a big roller with ridges on it, but also using the weather to help us, because very often frost can be very helpful in killing off some plants during the winter. I'm sure many of you know it from your garden, where plants die over winter, sometimes to come back again, sometimes not. So that trial actually proved very successful, and as a result, many farmers now are looking at alternatives to using glyphosate as part of their normal management practices where they want to reduce cultivations. The second example I'll give actually was looking at neonicotinoids, but this time for oilseed rape. We've actually not looked at sugar beet growing and how to reduce reliance on insecticides there, but we have done for oilseed rape, which is another crop which traditionally would have had a neonicotinoid seed dressing used. And here what we've done is look at alternative mechanisms for managing the beetle, which is the problem in oilseed rape. It's called a cabbage stem flea beetle. And just like sugar beet, it can cause massive reductions in yield where the cabbage stem flea beetle takes a hold in a crop. But interestingly enough, and I think this sort of brings me to the point I wanted to make, is about how we actually look at the whole system. And I think if nothing else, what I've learned really through a lifetime in agriculture is nature likes complexity. And I think what we've perhaps been doing over the last 30, 40 years is reducing that complexity, which is starting now to cause us problems. And perhaps going forward, we need to be looking more at nature-based IPM rather than agronomic IPM.
Great, Liz. Thank you very much. Liz, let me just ask you a quick question about this. I mean, what would you say for you when you first heard that this derogation was had been given the go-ahead? kind of emotionally, what did it do to you? That's kind of, you followed these issues for a long time. What
Very
was this?
sad. Yeah, just very sad, because as Caroline said, and I think there's this real kind of concern that if we allow them to be used, then it does take the pressure from finding alternatives. And I appreciate that, Tom doesn't want that to happen, but I do know it from the organic sector, where sometimes derogations are issued, and that immediately takes the pressure, and indeed the commercial necessity to do something about it. And I think
necessity is the mother of invention, that kind of thing.
Absolutely,
right.
Yeah, because it'll be just, everybody can breathe a sigh of relief and think, actually, okay, we don't need to worry for a bit.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, we've had 4 great introductions to this topic from our speakers. We know it can get complicated at times, so we're just going to, before we get into the Q&A, we're going to show you a video shortly from the Pesticide Action Network that summarizes how neonicotinoids impact bees. But just before we go to the video, I want to remind you, you can put comments or questions in the Q&A on YouTube and interact and talk to others who are watching the live stream tonight. We're up to at least 1,200 people watching live, and we always get thousands more people watching these after these wild lives as well, after they've been streamed. So do make sure you interact in there, ask your questions, have your comments. We will try and share as many of them as possible. But for now, here's a quick reminder on how neonicotinoids kill bees. Okay, well, I've already had over 100 of your questions passed to me, so we need to get on with them. And we're looking at the groupings of these. Obviously, there's quite a few questions that relate to, the specific decision for this year. What's new, in other words, or the sort of the theme of quite a lot of your questions. We have one, and a good one. I want to start with this, actually, from Paul. Is the current problem due to over-intensification of production methods? Let's just play that one first. That's an interesting one. Liz is nodding yes vigorously. Yeah. Liz, kick us off.
Yeah, I mean, I can. Well, I was thinking about this just before we came on air. I was looking at this whole issue of intensification and really how over the years, and it's no criticism of farmers, they've really been forced to, by the sort of economic situation, to try to increase yield. And in so doing, what we've had to do is breed ever more crops that will yield ever more. But as that focus just on yield tends to take your eye off other traits. And certainly with sugar beet, we've got a crop which really requires really looking after like a thoroughbred. And I wonder if perhaps, the problem with thoroughbreds is if you get anything wrong with their management, things go wrong. Perhaps we need to be looking at more resilient varieties of sugar beet that can cope with more difficult circumstances, not the one that's going to necessarily produce the highest yield.
Yeah, I mean, as I've always said, the problem is not, there's never been farmers, it's the problem is farming policy but we've got a big change of that now, haven't we? Brexit, whole new agricultural transition plan. Of course, if you missed it, the whole last episode of Wildlife was looking at this in December, so you can have 90 minutes of exploring the new agricultural transition plan with some great panelists on that back in December, if you want to look on catch up. So it's all solved now, isn't it, Liz, Caroline? It's new agricultural policy coming through.
All solved.
Sunny green uplands.
Yeah, if only. No, it's all in the melting pot right now with, as I said in my sort of like galloped talk, those who have been used to getting a subsidy equivalent to £240 a hectare face what can seem draconian cuts. That's just the start of it by 2024. In the meantime, as the money is taken out of the subsidy box and put into the box that is supposed to hopefully pay for more resilient farming, agroforestry, integrated pest management, we've got to figure out how much is going in there, how much is going to come out. We've then got to define what integrated pest management is, for example. So one of the new schemes, and it's all, for someone not working in agriculture, so the Sustainable Farming Incentive, the SFI, is due to start rolling out in 2022. That's got opportunities for things like integrated pest management and soil health. But explaining any of this to most people at the moment, I'm sitting with the farmers and going, do you think you'll come back again in 2 weeks' time, Caroline, when you've just digested what you've just told us? We're actually going to lose a lot of money, not just because of climate change. We've got to adapt, not just because of a virus disease or anything, but also because the whole political agenda is changing so that ultimately, hopefully, we become more resilient, more sustainable, and reverse the declines in wildlife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I could just jump
go on,
in.
Dave.
Sorry. I think people may have the impression that with agri-environment schemes being introduced in the last 20 or so years and so on, that farming is at least getting better. But actually, if you just look at the harsh statistics of pesticide use, it's going in the wrong direction still. If you look at DEFRA's statistics, anyone can look at them on their attractively labeled website, PUS stats. The area of land treated with pesticides, of arable land, each year is just over 17 times the area of actual land, which essentially tells you that each field is on average being treated 17 times. And that figure has gone up 70% since 1990. So farmers are using more pesticides than they used to. And also sugar beet is one of the most demanding crops. The figure is even higher at about 20 treatments per field. And
why is that? Why is that, Dave? I mean, pesticides cost money. Why would farmers be doing that?
Because they're being advised to do it very largely. Agronomists, unfortunately, often advise pesticide use, which may not always be necessary, but it's hard to know. It's sometimes an insurance use. And both farmers and agronomists are subject to marketing pressure from the companies that produce the pesticides. And many agronomists these days work for pesticide companies, so they have a vested interest in persuading farmers to use pesticides. So I think we haven't given farmers enough support in developing alternatives. Caroline's already mentioned IPM and this whole philosophy of treating pesticides as the last resort, which has been around for many decades. I was taught about it when I was an undergrad. As
opposed to routine, you mean?
Yeah, and for example, prophylactic use of pesticides is the complete anathema for the idea. Integrated pest management involves basically doing everything you can to avoid a pest problem and then only using a pesticide if your pest problem gets out of control and everything else has failed. So treating a seed before you even put it in the ground is completely incompatible with IPM. In my
okay,
view.
well, we might get into integrated pest management a bit more as we get through the questions, but I want to just come back to Tom. Let's just understand the problem farmers are facing this year, because I think anyone watching your video will have empathy with the situation you find yourself in, and particularly, you were saying that some farmers are experiencing, or last year experienced 80% losses of crop. I mean, that is a horrific situation. Let me just understand, what would you say is new here? I mean, you mentioned climate change, you said it being worse last few years, but yellow's virus is not a new problem. It's been around for many years, hasn't it? What's new?
So I think it's a good question. And I mean, in the past, this problem was solved with even worse chemicals than we're probably talking about now. And also we used to have cold winters. So it wasn't such a problem in the UK because we used to get frosts that killed off the aphid population. Aphid is a posh name for greenfly. So the climate is changing. And in response, farming has to change too. And we are going to be faced with this kind of problem more and more as we go through the next 30 years, where the population is going to increase, the climate is going to change, and the population are going to be more demanding about how they have the food grown and how farmers do that too. So this is like a straw in the wind. And we are faced with this decision where we could export our problems elsewhere into the world, where we don't have any say, and our society, which is sensitive to these sorts of things, will be give away control, if you like, of how we solve them. We've got to stay in the game to provide new solutions which are climate friendly, which are nature friendly. And in this case, staying in the game means, as Dave said, as a very last resort, when you've tried everything else, or there is nothing else in the toolkit, to have this in our back pocket. And that's why we've applied for this for sugar beet. And there's been a lot of things just said about sugar beet being a very needy crop. It's actually one of the most robust crops. I mean, it's amazing the amount of yield, because it stays in the ground for an awful long time. It can recover from almost anything that you throw at it once it's established. It's just that first 12 to 16 weeks where you really need to look after it. But if it was your child, you'd think it was a bit needy, but then once it hit adolescence, you'd be really pleased with how it was getting on. So sugar beet isn't a basket case. It's actually really robust.
There's not been a specific trigger. I mean, Joanna asked a question, said what's changed since 2018 when the UK Pesticides Committee and Health and Safety Executive refused the same request then. Would you say anything's particularly changed since then?
Absolutely. What changed was what we were asking for. We applied then in kind of a way as to carry on as normal. What we've applied for this time is very much more trimmed and restricted. So we've only applied for one insecticide, and that's thiamethoxam, which is actually, of the three neonicotinoids which were banned, it's the one that degrades down quickest in the soil. We've applied for a lower rate on the seed, so it's much less of it going into the environment. We've increased the time that we would not be able to sow any flowering crops into the same field. It will be 3 years before oilseed rape can be sown in the same field. None of that was in our application in 2018. And you're right, these committees have turned these down in the past when they thought the risks of harm were too high. But they've looked at our application this year, which we volunteered. It's actually, as I said in the video, it's one of the tightest restrictions anywhere that we have volunteered. And independent experts have looked at this and decided that we have done everything we can to make sure that the risk of any harm to the environment is low.
Yeah, with that application, as I understand it, there was a plan for also developing an alternative, sustainable approach. What would you say? What's holding that back? What more do you need from government or elsewhere to develop a more sustainable approach?
Well, it's just a question of time. It's as I said, we only get one go at this every year, and I think when the problem was the ban came in. You might not seem it to some NGOs and sort of on the nature side, but actually it came in as a bit of a surprise to farming, and we probably had grown too dependent on them as the one trick that fixed everything. So it was a ban, but there was no plan, and so what we've been trying to do since the ban came in was develop that plan, and so we're making it up as we go along. I mean, I haven't talked about it yet, but I'm doing that on my own farm too. I've actually conducted a trial last year releasing hundreds of thousands of lacewing larvae into a sugar beet crop. They another name for them is aphid lion. So they just eat hundreds and hundreds of greenfly each. But that is very early days. It's only been done in glass houses before now. And so I think the trial I did on this farm last year was one of the first ones in an open field, certainly in sugar beet. So it's not that we were kind of taken by surprise, I guess, and it's not a quick process to fix. In the long term, it will be down to the breeders, and they need the incentive to know that there's going to be a market for all the investment they put into developing these breeds that are just resistant to the virus. So, but we've got to find those bridging strategies. I completely agree.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Go on, Dave. Did you want to?
Sorry, I just thought it might be useful to throw in a different perspective here for a minute. So our government has decided to allow use of a chemical which we know is bad for the environment, so that we can maintain production of a crop which we know is really bad for us. Sugar is actually a crop with no nutritive value at all. So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm having a go at Tom. I'm really not, but we all know sugar is really bad for us. I did a quick Google earlier. The value of the sugar beet industry in the UK, as far as must be true, it was on Google, 208 million. Our government estimates that the cost of obesity is 27 billion per year, so well over 100 times as much. And a big contributor to that is our consumption of sugar. So one solution to this problem is to grow less sugar or accept lower yields of sugar. And if we grow less sugar, to grow healthy fruit and vegetables instead. And surely a government campaign to persuade us to consume less sugar. We actually already have a sugar tax. So on the one hand, government is taxing products with sugar in, and on the other hand, it's allowing a chemical to be used so that we can keep producing sugar. That doesn't seem to make any sense to me at all. So
Go on, Tom. Go on, Tom. You've got your rubbish shirt on. Have a go.
Well, sugar has no nutritive value. It has 4 calories per gram, which is the same as protein. It's less than fat, it's less than alcohol. And sugar consumption per head has been falling since for decades. But obesity and type 2 diabetes has carried on growing. So it's a more complicated picture. I'm not saying we don't eat too much sugar. I think government guidelines are it should make up about 5% of our diet. It currently makes up just under 10% of our diet. So there's a way to drop. But I talked about it in the video. I mean, we can eat less sugar, but we're still going to eat some sugar. And then the question is just the same. It's who is going to grow the sugar? Where is it going to be grown? And how are they going to grow it? And, you know, there isn't enough honey. There isn't enough agave nectar and all the sort of more fashionable sugars, which are still sugar, available. So sugar beet is actually, and I hope I got this across in the video, it's actually part of a rotation, which includes, right around here in the fens, we grow vegetables in that rotation. We grow beetroot, we grow celery, we grow salad crops, carrots, potatoes, all in that rotation. And sugar beet is a part of that rotation. So losing sugar beet will have a knock-on effect. I think we should grow more fruit and vegetables in this country. We don't grow anywhere near enough for what we eat. And people expect to be able to have avocados and you know, kiwi fruits at Christmas. And it's, you know, stopping producing the sugar in this country is not the same as stopping consumption of it in this country. And if all we do is decide that we can sacrifice farmers like me who want to grow it in environmentally nature-friendly way, and actually the carbon footprint of domestically grown sugar beet is a lot lower than some of the cane producers in the country, which ship it thousands of miles across the globe. So it's a much more complicated picture, both in terms of diet, both in terms of where you get your food from and who grows it. I don't think there are easy answers, and I'm afraid everybody's going to have to make compromises to get to some solution on this and everything else that we're going to have to deal with climate change and nature.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I mean, I appreciate absolutely the kind of conundrum you're in, Tom. And I think the answer has to be, actually, it comes back to all of us, what we want to eat. Because as farmers, we produce what people buy. And I think that, you know, until people actually want to change what they eat and how they consume food, it's quite a difficult place for Tom producing sugar. But I think there is definitely something in terms of the resilience of the crop And it might well be that as we go forward, we do need to have different varieties that don't just focus on yield, but focus on resilience, to being able to better withstand, insect attack, because there definitely are some crops just seem to better shrug them off better than others. And simply always focusing on just one thing, you get what you wish for, but you sometimes get other things as well that you don't wish for. So that might be one way forward, but but then the sugar would have to be worth more if your yield's lower, unless of course you spend a lot less on inputs, which could be possible.
Go on, Caroline.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Liz said about intensification and Tom's innovation in terms of releasing lacewings, because that sort of thing was the guts of what I grew up in and studied. One of the things I'm picking up very much when I speak to agronomists for big agri industry at the moment is that they see a kind of a defining line coming in between protected cropping, where there's already a lot of good work being done with the release of beneficial insects and predators. So I do wonder when the gates open at the end of the protected cropping and they fly out where they're going and what impact they're going to have on the rest of the community. But what I was wondering was, so releasing lacewings, it's always been difficult with projects like that to have the weather conditions long enough to have the lacewings do the job, eat the aphids, not get frozen cold along the way. What about, and I'm sure you're doing lots on this, what about encouraging the existing natural populations? Or have you been out picking lacewings from across the farm?
No, I brought them in. I have to say, I didn't go hunting with my butterfly net. But genius, Caroline. That's exactly what the problem was that we found with the trial this year. We were a bit late, and there were already natural predators in our crop by the time we were releasing the lacewings, and that is because this year, again, because of climate change, the aphids came a lot earlier than the native predators. So they were here like 2 or 3 weeks before anyone was up and running to eat them. So we're actually looking at something really innovative for our trial this year. These lacewings, as I say, are brought in. They're produced in a factory, and the way they feed up the lacewings is they also breed a type of moth which lays eggs, and these eggs are kind of like little protein packets, and they sterilize those eggs and they feed them en masse to the lacewings, which breeds up the larvae, which are then released into the field. So because we're out in the field, what we're actually going to be trying this year is actually broadcasting these sterilized moth eggs into the crop, which will be food for the existing beneficial insects and predators which are already out in the field. And of course, we can do things in the field to encourage those as well. We can have beetle banks, we can grow wildflowers at the side of the field, we can encourage grass margins and all this sort of thing, cover crops over winter. So there is a natural population of predators, and that obviously less expensive for us as well, but it's also, you're working with nature. But by also by feeding up, providing this food source, early food source for predators, when we release the lacewings, they will be able to get going a lot quicker. So yes, exactly the line of things we're looking at doing for this year. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Oh, look, we're going to circle back to alternatives again because it is such an important issue. But there's a few other things just about the decision now that we need to understand. We had a question from Christina, and there's been quite a lot of questions here that are along this theme. Christina's question: I understand field margins have to be kept clear of wildflowers. She says, just how much of, for example, Norfolk will have to be reduced to desert with glyphosate to achieve this? Now, what they're pointing at here, of course, is one of the conditions of the derogation from DEFRA, which is actually saying that, okay, we'll allow neonics to be used through this seed dressing, but then they're advising farmers to then use weed killer on killing the wildflowers that then come up around the sugar beet and in the field margins. Dave, why is DEFRA advising that?
So the concern is that any weed that pops up in and around the field that's been treated or used to grow the treated sugar beet, those weeds will themselves become contaminated with the pesticide which is in the soil. And
with the neonics.
With the neonics. And then if bees visit them, then they'll get poisoned. So it's a way of trying to prevent bees from being exposed. But of course, the downside of it means there's no food at all for bees, because bees, as we know, they don't feed on the sugar beet itself. They rely on weeds, as you might call them, or wildflowers, as you might also call them, for food. And essentially, this is this sort of scorched earth approach to sugar beet production, that you have to kill every other plant anywhere near to prevent bees from being poisoned with a neurotoxin.
Just to be clear then, so DEFRA is advising use weed killer to kill the wildflowers to save the bees.
Yeah, brilliant plan.
It'll starve the bees instead.
Is it really as simple as that? Because there might be an impression. Are you saying to me that DEFRA is encouraging that farmers go out and spray off their margins that are paid for by countryside stewardship? They're not doing that. So the field margins are still in place. As at Lower Smythe Farm at Worcestershire, we do a lot of focus on arable weeds in there as well. So from what I can see, I don't know what Tom's portfolio out there is, but things like groundsel in there. So groundsel, I'm sure, in stubble is great for feeding finches and things over the winter. It's also a vector, I gather, for the virus. But I think it's important to put my head on here and go, this isn't about going and spraying off with glyphosate the wildflower expensive margins that are, okay, with Dave's information and things, we can see these pesticides move, and that's another aspect to it. Would that be fair, Tom?
Yeah, I'm really glad this has come up, because this has been a really widespread take on the wording in the DEFRA statement, which said that the applicant, which is us, recognised that flowering weeds, wildflowers, in and around the sugar beet crop could present a risk. And then they go on to advise that, so when you grow sugar beet, you have a standard weed control program to control weeds in the crop. And they're saying, if you're using these neonicotinoid treated seeds, you have to abide by that standard weed control program. This is not DEFRA telling farmers to actually break the law and start spraying the verges of fields, hedgerows, and as Caroline says, wildflower strips that have been deliberately sown, or even fallow patches that have been left deliberately to encourage these arable weeds. So this is not a thing that is going to happen. It is really just saying, if you're having these seeds, you must abide by the standard herbicide program for a crop in field of the sugar beet. So yeah, I'm really glad that I got the chance to say that. Thank you, Caroline, for endorsing it too.
Liz, Dave?
I'm sure Tom's absolutely correct. I wasn't suggesting that a agri-environment scheme flower strip that had been subsidised was being sprayed off because of this. But I would think it would be very unwise to sow the treated sugar beet next to a flower strip, because then you would either have to spray it off or you'd be poisoning bees, because it would become contaminated. So having a neonic seed treated crop adjacent to a wildflower strip would be a very bad idea.
I think in a way that epitomises the problem we've got with neonicotinoids, because they're so easily translocated outside of the crop itself. That really is the nub of the problem here.
But that's a really interesting point, because with a lot of foliar applications, there would be buffer zones or LERAPs to follow. So I'm out of touch with selling.
You're bang on, Caroline. Carry on.
You go. Teach me.
So yeah, when we spray the herbicides on the field, we aren't spraying up to the margins. So I think this is just a general taking of the wrong end of the stick for that condition which has been applied by DEFRA. As to whether we should plant a neonicotinoid treated seed next to environmental margins, there are rules about how close you can get to them anyway. They're usually the other side of a grass margin or something similar. And my understanding is that, as with the seed, only 5 to 20% of the active ingredient is taken up into the plant. Even so, when it breaks down in the soil and can travel in water to the margins, again, wildflowers only take up about 5 to 20% of that active ingredient as well. And I think I'm not saying they're eliminating risk totally, but we are minimizing it so that it's acceptably low. And obviously, if you're stopping the bulk of the field having flowering weeds in it, which would poison pollinators, then around the edges is a much smaller area. And correct me if I'm wrong, Dave, because I'm not going to debate the science with you, because I'm sure you've done much more on it than me. But the amount that is in a wildflower, in the pollen, the nectar, is not enough to kill bees. It has what they call, rather sinisterly, sublethal effects on the bees. So it confuses them and it stops them feeding so intensively, and can have long-term effects on colonies and things like that. But for a one-year derogation, it's not like we're going to be killing the sort of 125 tons of bees, lorryfuls of dead bees everywhere from this particular aspect of the use this year.
Right, I'm going to come back to you in a second, Dave, and Liz as well on this point, and also about neonics when they get into water courses as well. But just to give you a flavour of some of the comments we've had in tonight, and I've tried to select some that give a balance of the points here. Charlie said, the sugar beet sector is working hard to find alternative ways of controlling virus yellows. In the meantime, we must ensure our British sugar beet sector is not sacrificed while this takes place. That's just to make you feel not alone there, Tom. Sarah says the negatives definitely outweigh any positives people can come up with. There's a reason why they were banned in the first place. Alison says not promoting the use of neonics, just saying we need to be careful where we point the finger. Consumers need to take responsibility. Peter says monoculture is not natural, and that's why a toxic pesticide is necessary. All farmland needs to be put to permaculture. So just to give you a flavour there. Dave, Liz, talk to us about neonics when they run into water courses as well. This is another sort of area of concern. We've talked here about neonics being picked up into other plants, into wildflowers. What if actually they run off or into soil, into water courses? What are the concerns there?
Sure. Shall I start?
Yes, please, Dave.
So there've been quite a lot of sampling of fresh water, both in the UK and in other countries, and neonics routinely turn up if they're being used in farming. We know that they do leach into fresh waters, and there was a big study from the Netherlands which found that aquatic insect diversity and abundance was, not surprisingly, negatively correlated to the concentration of neonics. So basically more insecticide in the stream, fewer insects, which is not really rocket science. But actually the most dramatic example I've come across of the harm done to freshwaters is, I tweeted just before this meeting started actually. In Japan, there's an enormous freshwater lake, which used to have, is the biggest lake in Japan, which used to have a thriving fishing industry until 1994, when they started using neonics on the rice around the lake. And within 1 year, the zooplankton population collapsed, and the fish all disappeared because there was nothing for them to eat. So that's just one piece of evidence. There's much more, but essentially it's really clear that these chemicals do get into fresh water and they do harm when they get there.
Yeah. I mean, certainly all the evidence that we've seen would suggest the same. I just wanted to go back to the point that Tom was making about the sublethal doses for honeybees, and certainly very often honeybees aren't the target species when neonicotinoids are used, but that sublethal dose might as well be lethal because it disorientates the bees so that they can't find their way home, and therefore rather than dying straight away, they probably die more slowly. So it does have an impact in a relatively short period of time. I think that's right, isn't it, Dave?
Yeah, they also impair the immune system as well, so that you can get outbreaks of viruses in your honeybee hive, and you might then conclude that your bees died of a virus, but actually it's because their immune system was knocked out by a sublethal dose of insecticide.
Okay, look, hang on. We're getting more questions on one subject than anything else. So I'm going to ask you all the same question, okay? And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to really push you to try and give a 1 or 2 sentence answer, okay? It's going to be really tough because I know what the question is and you don't, and it's going to be really tough. I mean, we've touched on it already. We're getting into it, but I think people kind of just want to hear a clean answer to this question. What are the alternatives? What are the alternatives to neonics?
Sure.
Dave, let's start with you.
Okay, my simple answer is we accept lower yields of sugar, we persuade people to eat less sugar, and if a farmer is in an area where he can't grow sugar beet without using neonics, he should grow some healthy fruit and veg instead, and we should support him in doing that.
Caroline.
I think the process that cereal farmers have had to go through, and also rape growers, where they just had to adapt to not being allowed to use the product. And that really spurred people on to decide whether they were going to grow it or not, and whether they could cope financially with the penalties that might be associated with that.
Tom?
Long term, the answer is resistant varieties. So trust in the breeders. They fixed it before. We had a disease called rhizomania, which threatened the future of the sugar beet industry, and now all sugar beet varieties are resistant to that. It's not a problem. So it can be done, but shorter term, we're much more limited. We can look at ways that the farm differently as an alternative. So as I said, with insects instead of insecticide, and various other things. But we can also look at economic measures. Sugar Board I'm part of also managed to get our processor, British Sugar, to cough up £12 million to compensate growers who have a reduction in yield. It doesn't compensate it fully, it cushions the loss. And I think the French government is also looking to have a fund, I think, of a similar amount to compensate their growers so that they can carry on growing the crop, but take the losses while we find the more longer term solutions. I think that's something that our government could look at too.
Okay, Liz, what are the alternatives?
Okay, I think the answer is more fundamental, really. Society has to take some responsibility for this, because it's all our decisions and what we eat that have kind of meant that we're where we're at now, with lots of examples where we're having to turn to, as Dave was talking about, more and more noxious pesticides. So I think the answers include much longer rotations for arable farming, so we're not going back to the same crops so quickly. And actually, probably most fundamental of all, stop fighting nature. Actually find ways of working with it rather than against it. Stop trying to kill everything that's in the field that might compromise your crop. And yes, it does include more resilient varieties of crops. So start choosing crops not because they're the highest yielding crop, but because they're more resilient.
So lots of questions here along the lines of what more could and should the government be doing to try and speed up the development of alternatives. Debbie in Hampshire has asked, where is the really serious, urgent effort being made into finding ways to grow food without any chemicals at all? Dave, when we were doing a tech test the other day, you were saying some very interesting things to me about government labs and so on, and what's happened over many decades around government labs and government research in this. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really sad, actually. If decades ago, we used to have a network of experimental farms funded by government doing research into how to grow food, essentially, and that would have been perfect if they still existed for doing research into agroecological approaches to food production, which is what we need. Perhaps tied together with a system of an advisory service to take the knowledge from those experimental farms and take it out to the farmers and help them learn how to, the latest developments in how to manage sugar beet pests or whatever it might be. But sadly, we basically sold off all of these farms over the last few decades. There's very few of them left. There's only really Rothamsted Research left, which is the oldest agronomic research station in the world. But they're funded almost entirely by Syngenta these days. So we've kind of pulled the rug on exactly the kind of research we should be funding, and really we need that to be reversed. But unfortunately, in this age of austerity and COVID, I can't see that happening anytime soon.
For people who don't know, what's Syngenta, Dave?
Syngenta are the company that make thiamethoxam, the product which has just been authorised, the neonic, for use on sugar beet.
Okay. Caroline, what more could and should the government be doing here to help ensure alternatives are there?
Speed up the output and results from the ELM, environmental land management tests and trials. Speak rapidly. You can see that there's activity going on. Like I got an email from one of my managers saying, look at all these civil service jobs looking for ELM officers. I thought she was trying to get rid of me. She said, no, it's just to tell you where things are in the process at the moment. There's, I think, about 90 trials out there at the moment. We're in one with 4 other wildlife trusts, which is one of the biggest in the country. And these trials include things like regenerative agriculture. Ours is about what the template for the whole farm plan might look like to help the farmer land manager claim money in there. So we need that information, we need the output, and we need the trials to be going alongside farmers getting paid sooner than it looks like they're going to be getting paid, land managers paid sooner. The system's not going fast enough.
Okay. Tom, what more do you need? What more do farmers need from government to help develop these alternatives?
I find myself in complete agreement with Dave, which is a great thing. And I think, yeah, the old days where there were government, the ADAS, I think, the ADAS you're referring to, Dave? Yeah, it was a great system. It was before my time. And something we touched on earlier was
ADAS, Tom, stood for Agricultural Development Advisory Service.
Yeah, I used to work for them.
Well, you could well be right. All I know is the acronym. But the other thing that was touched on earlier was that a lot of agronomists, which are the people who advise farmers, they've got the training in how crops grow and how to treat crops and what chemicals might be useful, as well as other ways of farming. Sort of the plant science experts of farming. That's what an agronomist is. A lot of them are now tied to the chemical companies, and I don't. I have an independent economist, and he taught me all I know about farming for various reasons. And I don't think you can get totally impartial advice from an agronomist it would be like going to the doctor and then being on the payroll of a drug company. So I think France is about to make that illegal. And I don't see why we couldn't have that here either.
Well, what would you estimate, Tom, or maybe others know? Roughly what percentage of agronomists that farmers make use of are funded by those chemical companies or linked to those companies, and which are sort of what percentage are independent?
I don't know. Caroline might have a better idea than me.
Well, I was just thinking back because Dave Golson and I looked at this a couple of years ago, but is it 70%? I mean, it's a significant amount.
Yeah, it depends who you ask, but and there don't be any clear published figures, but anywhere between 50 and 80% are to pesticide companies.
So, Tom, you're saying it'd be good to for the government to require agronomists to be independent?
Yes. And that's a personal view. It's just my view, but yes, I don't see.
Well, it's a good one. But it's a very interesting one. I've heard others say that in the past, and it seems if that could just bring around a bit more diversity of advice, that would be helpful. Liz, what more do government need to do to help develop these alternatives?
I think there's definitely 2 things. I mean, research into agricultural farming practices was mentioned by Dave. And I have to say right now, the level of funding that comes from government towards research into innovative and agroecological farming practices is very, very low compared to the level of funding for research into carrying on really becoming more intensive, more precision agriculture. So there needs to be a fundamental shift to support more farmer-led research, but research into practices rather than being intellectual property-led. That's one real clear and present need, I would say, and that needs to change fast. And the second thing, which it's not so much, at least it does need to change, it's almost sort of linked to that, the comment that Tom made about agronomists needing to be independent. And it was something that I had not appreciated till I travelled. And it's that if you look at all the inputs that farmers buy, the margins being made by chemical companies and also actually by veterinary products far massively outstrip the profits being made by any other input into agriculture, which basically means these businesses are making a lot of money out of persuading farmers to use their products. So the commercial incentive is massive. And that's why it's so important to get agronomy into the hands of independent advisors. And also, I think there needs to be something. So I well remember I did used to work for ADAS. Makes me feel very old. And we had a arable advisors in the teams as well as all types of advice. And the problem of being an arable advisor is the farmer will never know what would have happened to the crop if they hadn't used the product, but they sure as heck know if the advisor advises them not to use the product and things don't go well. I don't know, Tom, whether you'd agree that we need some sort of way that, I don't know how you manage that situation with your agronomist.
Yeah, I think if you can be your own agronomist, it's the best solution. So unfortunately, we don't have the sort of career structure in farming that you might have in other professions. So we are reliant somewhat on outside advice. Farming, it's one of my catchphrases, farming is more of a caste than a career. You don't get CPD points for farming unless you choose to. So whether a broader farming education structure is a good thing as well, I think would be a point of debate.
Right, so just to give you guys a bit more of a flavour of the comments we've had coming in tonight, Peter has said if we put sugar above bees and insects, that shows a very level low of understanding of ecosystems and sustainability. Shirley says, Tom, really good to hear you're talking about lacewings and that you are looking at more sustainably sugar beet rather than toxins. Mitch, just sounds insane. How can this be the best solution? Charlie, serious misunderstanding about weed killer on wildflowers. In fact, the condition is to ensure standard weed control practices are followed in the beet crop. And Andrew, it's not just bees getting confused. The evidence shows that neonics make bees more vulnerable to bacterial infection with lethal consequences. So, look, in the last few minutes, we've got less than 10 minutes, got 9 minutes left. Let's focus on the positive future that is hopefully ahead of us as we try and move forward on this. First question we've had in that I want to put to you, Caroline. What are the Wildlife Trust doing to try and support nature-friendly farming?
Oh, blimey. How long have you got? So we have, I think it's about 100,000 hectares or thereabouts of land that we manage. We own farms. We have the facilitation funds. We represent farmers and work with groups of farmers I was just making a note before you asked me there, the balance with agronomy, that we are training our staff. Some of them are getting the foundation in agronomy course, those that work with water companies and partnerships, and we're particularly trying to facilitate the journey from the system as is that is being dismantled into the future system, which will hopefully have some win-win scenarios in terms of both farm resilience and reversing the declines in wildlife, and have all this wonderful regenerative agriculture, agroecological, have all of that in there. But it needs us. So what we're doing also is things like this, and communicating with people and pushing hard for the right mechanisms to be in place to achieve this.
Great, thank you. Tom, you'll of course be very aware of the agricultural transition plan that the government introduced. As I was saying before, if you want to know more about that, look at the last episode of Wildlife on YouTube and a 90-minute discussion about the whole changes to agricultural policy here in the UK. But let's look over the next decade, Tom. What do you think the trajectory could and should be to promote more nature-friendly farming here in the UK?
I think we have to see, so the government's coming up with a new policy. We don't know the details of it yet in terms of what was a subsidy for already how much land you own is now going to be transitioned into a payment for producing things which people think are good. So environmental diversity and things like that. So, but the detail is still very much lacking. So watch this space, really. I think, but then there's also things that don't rely on government. So I'm really keen on farmers working together to make their own luck, if you know, if I can coin a phrase. It's all very well to be, because we're a bit like supplicants, because we don't really, as has been outlined, get much return from our supply chain. We're kind of like the economic plankton right at the bottom. We produce the stuff and all the value goes further away. And actually, if the only way farmers can fight that system is by working together in cooperatives and in farmer-owned companies to capture more of that supply chain, and then we can respond to consumers. And if consumers want these things to be produced in to a higher standard, they don't just want cheap food. So that's quite a big if. But if that's what they want, then farmers will be able to reap the rewards of providing that. So I think the answer isn't always with government. We've got to look to ourselves as well.
Dave, Liz, what would you see the potential for really reducing the use of pesticides over the next decade? I mean, the EU has now adopted a pesticide reduction target, hasn't it, to cut the use of pesticides by 50% by 2030. Do you think we could and should do the same here? Do you think do you feel confident that we could be on that trajectory or not? Liz?
I would say, first of all, what we've got to do is actually make it the most sensible way for farmers to farm, because at the moment,
Liz, you're breaking up a little bit.
The externalities of food product pollution that they currently I'll turn the camera. Yeah. So I think it's got the future policy has to make farming and reduce reliance on pesticides the most obvious way for farmers to farm, because right now for some farmers it actually makes more financial sense not to farm in this agroecological fashion. So it has to be the best way that has to be seen as the best way for farmers to farm. That's the most fundamental thing that needs to change.
Okay, Dave?
I would love to see a really radical shake-up of the whole food production system. We basically need farming that looks after the soil, that captures carbon in the soil, that looks after natural enemies and encourages them instead of using pesticides, that looks after pollinators, that provides a healthy diet for humans. And I don't think this intensive giant monoculture cropping system that we've developed is the right one. I'd love to see more exploration of things like permaculture and agroforestry and organic farming, biodynamic farming. There are really alternative models which promise or have the potential to feed us in a way that actually doesn't impact on the planet and is sustainable long term. That's my kind of vision.
Dave, we have seen quite astonishing, shocking declines in the abundance of insects over the last 40, 50 years. I mean, since the early 1970s, it's estimated roughly the abundance of insects has halved, and that's, say, in my lifetime. And lots of people remember, the classic story about insects on windscreens and car number plates in the 1970s and 80s and no longer there. So if we've lost 50% of our insects over the last 40, 50 years, what state are those populations in now? I mean, how much more of a hit can they take, would you say?
Well, I mean, we're at a kind of critical moment, aren't we, in mankind's evolution. And if we carry on the way we have done, we're looking at the next generation inheriting a really impoverished planet with, a lack of bees and other insects, damaged soils. Life's going to be really grim. We are in the midst of a crisis, not just the climate crisis that everyone's most familiar with, but a biodiversity crisis. So, we really need to take stock and radically change direction. And if we do, insects will recover really quick. And one of the nice things about insects is, they can breed really fast. Bees could be, could thrive within a few years if we just stopped killing them and making our landscape so hostile to them.
We did have a question, we've got to wrap up now, but we had a question from one person. Sorry, I forgot your name because there's almost 200 questions in front of me, but we had one question. Oh, look, there we are. I found it. Jake, since the ban on neonicotinoids, have we seen an increase in insect populations? If not, why not? You were just saying, bee populations can rebound quickly. So have we seen bee populations do really well over the last 3 years?
So neonics were banned in the end of 2018, and because most of the crops are autumn sown, that meant the 2019 crops were all neonic treated. So actually 2020 was the first year.
You mean flowering crops as well, Dave? That was 7 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. the honest truth is we don't have a really accurate bee monitoring program in place. But all the evidence we have suggests that insects are still declining. The best data we have are for butterflies and moths, and they're clearly still declining, sadly. And we have less direct evidence for bees and hoverflies, but they sadly also seem to be declining. So there's no sign of a recovery as yet. But then, you know, neonics, as I said, that were still used until 2019, essentially. And where they have gone, they've been replaced by other insecticides. And we shouldn't get totally hung up on neonics. All insecticides kill insects, and many of the ones that are replacing neonics are probably no better.
Funny, they do the job they've been designed to do. Look, we've got to bring this to a close, I'm afraid. I'm going to get to the panel. I'm going to give you all a chance for a final last word, and you're bursting with one, Caroline. Your last comment, please.
I think we need to think beyond pesticides as well. At Laura Smythe Farm, we had an Oxford University PhD student who monitored our solitary bee populations. We were one of over 20 farms, and she had to exclude us from the statistics because we had such high populations of solitary bees, leaf cutters, and things like that. But the key thing was, we don't use pesticides, we don't use slug pellets, but with the wild pollinator health check, we provide the more subtle habitats that many of these species need that are not currently met by existing agri-environment schemes.
Thank you, Caroline. Just to check, this derogation is actually for 3 years, not just one, isn't it, Tom, as I understand it?
It's for 1 year. It's for 1 year only, and that's only if Rothamsted say that the forecast is that we will get the virus above a certain threshold. DEFRA did signal that they realised that we might not have fixed the problem in just 1 year, so they have signalled that we might want to apply for another 2 years, but I hope not.
Okay, give us your final comment then, Tom.
I think, well, thanks. I mean, it's great that I've been invited on and I've been listened to, and we've had a friendly debate. I think it shows that, you know, farmers care about their farms, and their farms are in the environment and depend on the environment. Farmers are friends of nature and not against it. And I think the more we can do to communicate that to the general public and to the NGOs and everything, and the more we can make common cause. We've all got these problems and they affect all of us. We can't have quick fix solutions that, I mean, I'm afraid the world is a complicated place and it requires complicated solutions. Okay.
Thanks, Tom. I think you would have won a lot of empathy from people tonight. I think you made your case well, even if you haven't necessarily convinced everyone. Dave.
I guess just a final thought. You know, we all have power here. For example, in what we choose to buy and eat. And if we all decided we were only going to buy organic food, or we all bought local foods, decided to eat seasonal food rather than those avocados and mangoes and whatever, then that would both support local farmers that were producing food in sustainable ways and massively reduce our personal footprints on the planet. So I would say, you know, everyone needs to get involved and do their bit.
Thank you. Liz, your final comment.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say it is in our hands. It is up to us as citizens how we choose to live our lives. And actually, there is a blueprint. Organic farming doesn't rely on pesticides in anything like the same way. In fact, there's a tiny, minute fraction. And organic food is experiencing increased demand. So we're almost starting to see that vanguard of people who want to choose to eat differently. And on organic farms, there is 50% more wildlife and 30-odd% more soil organic matter on average. So we do have a way of farming that doesn't require pesticides.
Great. Well, look, I want to give a huge thank you to all our panelists tonight for engaging in this discussion in such a sort of robust but friendly way. Huge thank you to Caroline, to Dave, to Liz, and of course for Tom braving the lion's den, as it were, the organic lion's den. to really make his case. And thank you to all of you that have been asking brilliant questions and comments online, way more than I would ever have time to get through. But they're there for everyone to look at afterwards as well on YouTube. You can see them. At the Wildlife Trusts, we have huge empathy with the situation that farmers such as Tom find themselves in. We've looked at this issue carefully, but we have concluded we can't possibly support this derogation, and we have to oppose it because we're very concerned. It is such a toxic chemical, and we've already seen such phenomenal big declines in insect populations over the last 40-50 years, lost half of the abundance of our insects over the last 40-50 years. We cannot afford to lose any more. In fact, we have to restore the abundance of our insects. That's why we're opposing this derogation, and we're very concerned that actually it could easily turn into a 2-year, 3-year derogation. And as one of the panelists said tonight, actually, we really have to put pressure on government and companies and others to develop these alternatives, much as the alternatives is not necessarily shifting from one bottle to another, but perhaps system change and looking at integrated pest management instead. And we have to move on that rather than always reaching for the bottle of neonicotinoids and yet more chemicals to put on the soil. That's why the Wildlife Trust is opposing this. But we will continue to work with farmers, as we've done for decades, to try and help support more nature-friendly farming. And we will continue to push for agricultural policy to support farmers to deliver more nature-friendly farming. And the reason is, we've talked a lot about alternatives tonight, but I'll tell you this, there's no alternatives to bees. We need bees. You cannot have a replacement for bees. That's why we need to protect bees and other pollinators for our food security and for all our wildlife. Now, we've had a good debate tonight, but the one thing that has united all of us, of course, is our love of nature and our love of insects and the need to see insects put into recovery and to restore the abundance of insects. So as we play out, we'll show you a video about doing just that and celebrating just how beautiful insects are. But thank you for watching. Thanks for your engagement, all your comments and questions. Of course, if you support Wildlife Trust in opposing this derogation, you can take our action online. But have a fantastic evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.